Two Nobel Peace Prize winners who campaign against sex being used as a weapon of war. A new US Supreme Court justice accused of sex abuse when he was a teenager. Brett Kavanaugh, Harvey Weinstein, Kevin Spacey. The list goes on. So do the crimes. Why? Is there really such a thing as a rape culture? Well, as the fingers are being pointed at the United States in particular, perhaps the real question should be, why has the entire world allowed such subjugation for so very long?
The United States is in the grip of a sexual abuse crisis, from Hollywood to the White House, and now the Supreme Court. High-profile men have been forced to explain historical allegations of sexual misconduct. Does America suffer from an insidious rape culture? The term rape culture was first coined by American feminists in the 1970s, amid growing concern that it was becoming normalised. It fosters the idea of blame to disempower victims.
It's already very hard for people to come forward to begin with, and we already have a culture of victim blaming, and people are really afraid to talk about things that happen to them.
The most recent example is Brett Kavanaugh's appointment to the US Supreme Court. The judge was accused of carrying out a number of sexual offences during the 1980s.
I believed he was going to rape me. I tried to yell for help. When I did, Brett put his hand over my mouth to stop me from yelling.
Kavanaugh denied the allegations. And at a rally in Mississippi, President Trump mocked Christine Blasey Ford's account of the alleged attack.
How did you get home? I don't remember. How'd you get there? I don't remember. Where is the place? I don't remember. How mmany years ago was it? I don't know.
Is this discreditation of a rape allegation an example of a deeper problem? The president himself is facing accusations of sexual misconduct by at least 15 women. The Harvey Weinstein scandal in Hollywood last year sparked the Me Too movement and called time on the silencing of rape victims. But has anything really changed? The rate of reported sexual assault in the United States has fallen 63% since 1993. But still today, 1 out of every 6 women in America say they have experienced rape or attempted rape in their lifetime. In the 1980s, American films such as Fast Times at Ridgemont High celebrated the rape and objectification of women and linked it to the frat boy culture of American high schools and universities. A judge in California recently granted the early release of Brock Turner, convicted of a sexual attack. He was a former swimming star at Stanford University.
Brock maintained that what we like to call rape was in fact an innocent mistake, blaming it on the alcohol and promiscuity. And Judge Persky decided to take his word for it.
The young man's father argued his son's future shouldn't be compromised by what he described as 20 minutes of action. The accusations facing Brett Kavanaugh highlight a bigger issue than just the Supreme Court nomination. It raises questions over America's handling of sex abuse allegations, both historical and present. Is the US legal system designed to protect abusers from their past actions? What about the victims? And what are the implications for society?
We travel first, I'm glad to say, to the United States. Joining us via Skype from Washington, D.C., David Smith, The Guardian's Washington correspondent. Move to the other coast, Los Angeles, Amanda Riggle, feminism researcher at the University of California. Back here in the studio, we have Hillary Margolis, specializing in women's rights at Human Rights Watch, and Dr. Shola Mos-Shogbamimu, co-founder of the Women's March, a lawyer and an author. Excuse me, I think my voice may be going. You're going to have to do a lot of talking on this program. Amanda, let me come to you first. Is the tide turning?
I think the tide is the same, but people are more aware of the current, to keep the metaphor going. Rape culture in the US is just culture. If we look back into history, we have Abigail Adams writing John Adams during the penning of the Constitution, asking for him to remember the women. And we see a document that says persons at a time where women weren't considered people. So there's never been a place in the U.S. for women's voices. We see that in the Constitution, we see that in the amendments, and we see that echoed in the courts.
You see, I've wondered about this obviously for some time because it's been in the headlines, and I don't know anybody who would think that a rape culture was the right thing. I didn't grow up with people who felt the same thing. Surely it's just a minority of people who think that rape as a culture is okay. Amanda, and then back to the studio for that one. Surely it's just a small number of people, isn't it?
I think that...
Amanda first, and then Shola will come to you.
I would say, unfortunately, no. And a lot of people don't see it as they're doing something wrong. They see it as an entitlement. Women's bodies are there to be commented on, are there to be whistled at, are there to be judged. Women are called beautiful before they're called anything else. Like if you have a doctorate degree, you're first a pretty woman, and then whatever comes after. So yeah, women have always been prized with their looks, and
but that's got nothing to do with rape, has it? What you're calling a rape culture is the, if you like, the subjugation of women. Shola, is that the case, rather than rape per se?
It's not just rape per se. I think the word rape covers a multitude of subjugation of women, definitely. It's really more about the culture of impunity. That thinking that men can do what they want and get away with it. And if you listen to some women who go, okay, what exactly did they do? And when they listen to what has been done, they go, well, that is not so bad. It was just this or it was just that, which actually fosters that rape culture. The rape culture is not just about the physical intrusion of a woman's body. It's also the emotional. It is also the ability to be able to break a woman down in every aspect. That is rape. If you can rape a woman mentally, you can rape her physically, emotionally. That is all part of it.
You can't legally.
But I think it's also...
we know what rape actually is by
That's why I said
law.
Rape is not just about the physical intrusion. It's also about much more than that.
The rape culture, perhaps, but rape is about that. It has to be.
Yes, but it's not
And so what you're doing is you're
that.
lumping it all together and making even the simplest of perhaps not meant to be offensive jokes, but ridiculous comments.
But that's what we're talking about here.
I think when we're talking about rape culture, and certainly not only in the United States, I mean, I see it in countries around the world, including in the UK as well, you're not just talking about impunity for rape, for example, or for specific crimes. What you're talking about is an entire culture that has allowed people to make light of sexual assault and sexual violence and sexual harassment, to the point that we end up in courtrooms where survivors of rape are treated as though they are to blame for what happened.
What about
where
wolf whistles?
Their history is criticized.
I might term it.
So,
but what about these wolf whistles?
But you talk about wolf whistling, and for me, that actually does nothing but to belittle what women are actually going through. We're talking about serious issues here.
Yes.
And the moment you talk about wolf whistling, you make it sound as though, why complain about that? Yeah. Without understanding that that is also part of the problem, depending on who is doing wolf whistling and the intention behind it. But let's not digress. The bottom line is this: the culture of impunity and the rape culture fostered what happened in that Kavanaugh and Dr. Ford testimony in that Senate hearing. Because what you had there was a catastrophic, abject failure of due process. It was absolutely a case of she was a liar first, before anybody was really paying attention to whether or not she was telling the truth. And he was presumed innocent before proven guilty, as though that cannot apply both ways.
Isn't it? I mean, that's the genuine premise of the rule of law.
Apply both ways.
But this wasn't a court.
David, can I bring you in as the only other male on this panel, both from your gender point of view, but also as a correspondent in Washington? My first question to Amanda was, does she feel the tide is turning in any way, shape, or form? As a journalist, do you think you're seeing something different here, a sea change?
Yes, to the extent of the Me Too movement in America is exactly a year old, and that has been an important cultural shift. Although I agree, it's very much the start of something, and there's a tremendously long way to go. Mm-hmm. We have seen over the past year this amazing array of high-profile personalities brought to book, and of course Bill Cosby actually sentenced to prison. Some of the leaders of media companies forced out of their jobs, various high-profile broadcasters. That perhaps is at least a start, because it does send some kind of message that sexual harassment in the workplace should not be tolerated. Fascinating to speculate whether it would happen in quite the same way if Hillary Clinton had beaten Donald Trump in the 2016 presidential election, or as we saw with the Women's March, was there perhaps some sort of cultural backlash against a man many would say is a misogynist and an accused sexual harasser himself. But Me Too has at least put this in the cultural conversation. We also saw the limitations of it with the Kavanaugh case, where Me Too collided with white male patriarchy in Washington, and we saw eventually which was the winner of that in many ways. But I think, your phrase rape culture, the word culture is important there. It's a whole set of assumptions, it's atmospherics, and at least Me Too is starting to turn the tide.
And what about Trump's comments that this is a very scary time for young men? Not just from a reporter's point of view, but also from a male point of view, David, if you don't mind.
I'm speaking as men's spokesman, clearly, which I do all the time, naturally. I think a ludicrous comment, very Trumpian. His son has been pushing similar rhetoric. I mean, it was the natural Trump and Republican response to play into male victimhood and male grievance culture, and after all, a lot of the Trump election rhetoric is about victimhood and grievance, whether it's on gender or race or class to an extent. Sure, we don't want anybody, male, female, anything else, who's innocent, wrongly accused, but I think this is just not happening on any significant scale.
You bring up a very important point there, and Amanda, let me come to you, then throw it around the table. Is there not a case of there being a sort of like a Salem witches trial of anybody who may have committed what they would term to be a misdemeanor in the past, and being hauled before the court of public opinion, as well as perhaps before a court of law?
I mean, false accusations are extremely rare. When we're talking here about people being kind of held accountable, what comes to mind here for me is Louis C.K. He was accused, he did this "I'm sorry for being caught" apology, and he's already kind of trying to sneak back on stage and doing stand-up to test the waters to see how long he's going to be held accountable before he can kind of re-enter his career. So when we say that the Me Too movement is having an effect, the lasting power of that effect is really what we're looking at now. And I don't know if he's going to try again. I don't know if Kevin Spacey, who was accused of kind of with men instead of with women, if he's going to be held more accountable than, say, Bill Cosby, who got away with it for longer than I've been alive. So. Okay,
well, Hillary, you've been nodding at an awful lot of what has been said so far. Your chance now to vocalise those nods. So what do you make of what you've heard?
I mean, I think first to go back for a second, as an American particularly, to go back for a second to this statement about it being a dangerous time for young men. Well,
a scary time. Yeah.
Frankly, it's a very scary time in the United States for young men of color, absolutely, but not because of this, because of all of the other many policies and many actions that are being taken by the administration that are putting them and their lives at risk, which is a different issue. But to make this comment implying that men and boys are being accused willy-nilly of sexual assaults under false pretenses is completely irresponsible. And then you look at the case which was brought up in your piece about Brock Turner. You look at the case of, in Northern Ireland recently, of the sort of infamous rugby rape trial.
Yeah.
You know, there are plenty of young, frankly, white men who are not being necessarily held accountable for their actions. And so I think that kind of comment is ludicrous, and it does not help the debate.
I started off by talking about whether things were changing slightly. And Shola, I was interested in a comment you sent in to our producer before the program, saying that you thought Trump was sort of nixing the Me Too movement to some extent. I would argue that perhaps he's actually giving it oxygen by being an absolute idiot and saying the things that he's saying. I suppose I could argue that, but as a journalist, I'm really not supposed to. But he's actually helping, isn't he, get this conversation out there?
Trump being Trump only highlights the fact that there are many men like him who probably don't have the guts to be as vocal about their own ignorance as he is. But the difference you find here, and the reason why I would say the tide is turning, is because before, when women spoke, they weren't being listened to. What the women's movement has done now is to bridge the gap between women being listened to and something being done about it. There's a difference there.
What's that?
And let me just quickly add this.
Yeah.
With respect to Trump's comments, which is highly irresponsible, totally disgraceful. But the point about it is this: nobody wants men or women to be wrongly accused of anything, which is why justice in any forum is required to be objective, impartial, rendered upon corroborated evidence, and it has to be gender blind.
I know you want to carry on, we could talk about this for hours, but I do want to get onto the international side of this. And take a look over my shoulder. I don't know whether you can see it, but it says in one of the banners, it's not that you don't believe women, it's that you don't care. Now, rape as a weapon of war has been outlawed for more than a century. We had a treaty, 1979 Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, and this was one of the main things. United States hasn't signed it. And what kind of indication is that to the rest of the world?
Well, I think that's one indication, but to be honest, I think there are actually much stronger indications of where we are in terms of condemning sexual violence and condemning rape around the world. I mean, number one, just to get back for a second to your previous point, yes, Trump makes comments that have galvanized women and men who oppose them. At the same time, the fact that someone who, as has been pointed out, has been repeatedly accused of sexual assault himself, has made numerous public misogynist comments,
Hillary,
to be elected.
With due respect, I mean, we only have a limited amount of time.
Yes,
We've
but
talked
that
about
is,
Trump. Let's
but
move
that
on.
sends a message to people. And there are leaders not just in the U.S., there are leaders in other parts of the world, in Europe. So my point is that it sends a global message about how we value women, how we value sexual violence
so
or
how
not.
important is it, this is for everybody, that Nadia Murad and Denis Mukwege, generations apart in terms of age, have actually won a Nobel Peace Prize for this?
It is the most resounding statement of support, the most resounding statement of this is who society has to be, the global society has to be, that you can have. Because what has happened with the Nobel Peace Prize is to trumpet the work that these two activists has done, what they've done, to highlight the fact that the world will no longer tolerate women being used as tools of oppression and tools of war. The world is going to celebrate those who, in their individual capacity, can bring about change. That is what we need. We need to keep highlighting things like this.
Can I ask David a question? Because he was an Africa correspondent for such a long time. Well, 6 years, I think it was.
What part of Africa? It's a big continent.
He travelled a lot, an awful lot. He'll tell us if it applies to a particular country. When it came to sex abuse as a weapon of war, was it pretty pervasive?
Well, as your fellow guest mentions, Africa is a big place. So, no, I would not say, in a continent of 54 countries and a billion people, I think pervasive would be painting too broad a brush. However, the reality of this is undeniable in some of the places I went, like the Democratic Republic of the Congo and South Sudan and others. More broadly, I was actually based in South Africa for 6 years, and I remember A story I covered about 10 years ago was just a survey. 1 in 3 South African men admitted committing rape. That's not even being caught, but just admitting it. So an immense problem. And this is great news about the Nobel. I interviewed Dennis Mukwege more than once, and he's been attacked. His property has been attacked, and
his children threatened, I think, yes, as well.
Yes, and a tremendous moral example. And I think anything that highlights this issue and the winner's great work is to be applauded. But again, clearly, it's one drop in an ocean, and this is an issue that has to be tackled on a far more fundamental level that involves boys and girls when they're very young.
Amanda, I will come to Hillary in just a second, but Amanda, it is a global problem, one that you feel is now suddenly perhaps getting a bit more attention.
I don't think it's suddenly getting a lot of attention. I think it's suddenly getting a lot of attention from the media, which is very different than saying that the culture hasn't been aware of it. The media is not necessarily picking up on the different movements. It did pick up on the women's marches because it was such a huge, massive movement, but that doesn't mean that women weren't organizing before that, and that women weren't speaking out before that. In the US, we can look at, people still cite Planned Parenthood, or I'm sorry, Roe versus Wade as our kind of standard abortion case. But when you look, it's actually Casey versus Planned Parenthood, which has downgraded the right. We have, I think, 7 states in the US which now only have like 1 abortion clinic open. And we're talking Virginia, we're talking Kentucky, fairly large states. This isn't something small.
Hillary, I'm going to have to, we're running out of time, I'm sorry to say, but Hillary, yesterday, before the Kavanaugh confirmation, the Bronx rapper, My Son, said he was arrested. There's a culture of sexual violence, rape culture, that men have benefited from. Spell out where the benefits have come from other than sexual gratification, if there is such a thing in rape. But where have the benefits come from?
I mean, I think it's, enormous power and influence and control. And I think, really, when you look at sexual violence, for example, as a weapon of war, it's just a symptom of the fact that it's one means of many that has been used over centuries to control women. That's right. As well as children and others, but often women. And I think a lot of it comes out of a fear of what will happen if women are given as much power as perhaps they should be, as they deserve. In the case of the Nobel Prize, it's fantastic, and it does help draw attention to us, but we also have to move towards accountability, towards something more than just awareness and just acknowledgement of the work.
Some men who are involved in this undoubtedly should be neutered, but what about the male population as a whole in a broader sense? Do you think this could go too far and it could demasculinate? Or emasculinate.
But that's not the purpose of the movement. The point is there are many men that I work with in the movement who actually get this. They are feminists. My father is the first feminist that I know of. And the reality is, for us to really drive a society that is inclusive, diverse, tolerant, it should be men and women working together to ensure that we end all forms of inequality.
You might not agree with an awful lot of what Boris Johnson says, but
I don't agree with Boris Johnson, period.
Today he writes, so bring on that tide of holy feminist rage and let it wash this horror away.
Oh, I responded to that. I told him to put a sock in it because he doesn't know what he's talking about, and he is part of the problem. He's a perfect example of what an old, white, privileged, entitled man would say. And he thinks we're going to forget that he made very, rude, disrespectful, bigot comments about women. We're not going to forget, Boris. So put a sock in it.
David, quick last word from Washington, D.C. Suggestions yesterday that the arguments over Kavanaugh will not go away, that if there are other things that come out, he could be impeached. Is he there for life, or could he go?
I think what we saw was the Me Too movement has got as far as a realization women must be heard. And so we did see Dr. Christine Ford giving testimony on Capitol Hill and in front of the TV cameras. However, it's not got as far as actually holding men accountable, because at the end of the day, like Clarence Thomas in 1991, Brett Kavanaugh is still on the Supreme Court, and the impeachment talk, I think, is a bit speculative. Some of the leading Democrats are playing it down. They realize it could rally Republican voters in next month's midterm election. So I think now that he's in that seat, there'll be no going back. We just have to pray for the health of Bader Ginsburg. We don't have to go again.
Yeah. Okay, David, thank you very much indeed. Amanda, thank you. Clarence Thomas, of course, still on the Supreme Court and now regarded as perhaps one of the more establishment figures, given all the fuss there was over his nomination back in the 1980s. Thank you all very much indeed for coming in. We've kicked this one around just a few times under different titles today. It was rape culture, but as my guest was saying, rape culture covers so many different things, not just rape. It is subjugation as a whole of women in this world. I'm just going to say goodbye because my voice is going. Thank you very much for being here. Thank you for watching. See you next time.